Welcome to the Retaining WIT podcast. I'm Josie Haynes.
And I'm Jordana Kwok.
This show tackles the challenges of keeping women in tech.
Each episode, we discuss current events, experiences in the industry, and what it takes to create a workplace where women will thrive. On today's episode of the Retaining WIT podcast, we are joined by Yuliya Falkovich, Head of Engineering for Chassis Capability at Ion Analytics, a division of Ion Group. The main topic of our conversation today is bouncing back from layoffs, which is a crucial topic in our current tech landscape. Before we dive in, though, let me take a moment to introduce Yuliya. Yuliya is a seasoned professional with over 25 years of software engineering and development team management experience. She is leading a globally distributed team of software engineers building innovative products and laying the foundation of reusable UI and natural language search components. In the past, she has held numerous senior level positions on the Selerity team, serving as Director of Application Development prior to Ion's acquisition. Yuliya's extensive professional experience spans the financial, media, and technology industries. Prior to Selerity, she held various senior engineering and management roles in Morgan Stanley's fixed income technology department, Thomson Reuters media department, as well as in various startups. Yuliya is bilingual in English and Russian and currently holds a dual Bachelor of Arts Degree in mathematics and computer science from New York University. Yuliya, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
We're looking forward to learning more about your career journey and then diving into our conversation on how to bounce back after layoffs.
Yuliya, thank you so much for joining us as well. And why don't we start from the beginning? What inspired you to pursue a career in tech? And what challenges did you face in the early stages of your career?
Hi, well, nice to meet everyone. Thank you for having me. So yeah, I guess I'll start from the beginning. So I'd say I drew a lot of inspiration from my dad. He was a mainframe programmer in Soviet Union, which is where we immigrated from, the country that no longer exists. And he had a degree in math, and he encouraged me to develop my math skills. It was also kind of a different time. I guess I'm kind of aging myself here, but at the time when I entered college, personal computers were a rarity, and the internet for the masses just didn't exist. In fact, I started out as a math major, and then I later switched to a double major in math and computer science during my junior year of college. So yeah, I guess for me, the most important professional consideration was really being pragmatic as a recent immigrant. So it was pretty common, I guess, for a lot of people that immigrated from Soviet Union to go into computer science. I had the skills, I had natural inclination to it, but I wouldn't say, I wasn't one of those kids coding when I was a kid. But also, again, I didn't have the opportunity to do it. It was a different time back then, like I said. But yeah, I think having a career in computer science served me really well, and I'm really glad that I took that path. So I would say, as far as challenges go, I think I did. Well, actually, the interesting part is when I started out as a math major, there were even fewer women there, like a lot fewer. So it was funny when I switched to computer science, there were a lot more women in that department. So it was actually, in that sense, it was kind of more comfortable to me, the environment when I got the double major. So I wouldn't say it was I didn't really have a lot of big obstacles. I had the skills. I did really well in college. And when I started my career, I progressed really well, and I didn't really experience a lot of negative impacts that some women might have faced in computer science. So I guess partially it's just luck. I don't know, but yeah, I wouldn't say it was super challenging. It was a really good career choice, and it worked out for me really well over the years.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear there are environments where women can really thrive and not encounter the challenges that we often hear. It's really nice to know that it's not everyone's experience as well. And there are great opportunities for women to get an education in computer science without encountering these barriers.
Yes.
So, what inspired you to go from an individual contributor to management when you were starting in your career? Can you share any advice for our listeners on making this transition?
Yeah, so I would say pretty early on, I was always interested in understanding a bigger picture and a wider strategy of, why we're building something, not just working on a small piece of it, but really kind of seeing the whole product as we're building it, and understanding how all parts fit together. So that was always kind of a strong interest of mine. So it was sort of a natural progression for me that, I started out as an individual contributor. And then, well, actually, the interesting part is my first job was in a really small company. And I was the only one that, it was early 90s, I was the only one that did Java back then. So I was building my own application all by myself. So I wasn't even part of the team. So in that sense, it was great because, I got to build the whole application and I was kind of my own person on that project. So that was my first experience. And then from then my next job was in Morgan Stanley. That was like 4 years later, my second job out of college. And that kind of like turbocharged my experience and my career, in a sense, the 8 years that I spent there. And that's where I made the transition from individual contributor to engineering manager. So I would say, in terms of advice, how to make that transition, uh, it's I definitely would say it's very challenging the first time you make that transition, because when you're an individual contributor, it's really, and if you're particularly really good at it, when you make the transition to the manager, it's like really, really hard to delegate. You just want to do everything yourself. It's very frustrating when people take a really long time or they don't do it right. You just want to step in and do it. And that tendency, like it really took me a long time to get past that to some degree, because that's exactly the thing that you should not be doing as an engineering manager. So yeah, I mean, it was challenging in the sense of like how to get to that level, and that's because the other part that I should add is that, especially I know women tend to do this a lot, that they work really, really hard and they think that that will get them noticed, just working hard. And that's not how things work. I mean, that's not how people get promoted, not because they work hard. It's yes, it's working hard, but also visibility, knowing that, making sure that people know the hard work that you're doing. But ultimately, the biggest thing that makes a difference is having a sponsor, somebody who is higher up that knows you're good and wants to promote you. Otherwise, like if you try to do it on your own, it's very difficult to have any leeway and make any headway in your career that way.
Thank you for sharing that advice. And I really loved that you touched on the fact that it is really hard sometimes when you do that transition the first time, especially, for engineers, but for a lot of roles, the things that make you a good IC are not the same things that make you an effective and good manager. And so often, we promote the best ICs to management and then don't really set them up for success with like the training that they need. And so I love that you touch on that, because I think so often people just think, oh, it's the next step in the career ladder. And ultimately, it's really kind of a whole new career in and of itself.
Yes.
And so I really love that you touched on that. And, you've progressed through numerous leadership roles, from senior software engineering manager at Selerity in January 2014 to currently you're the head of engineering for chassis capabilities at Ion Analytics. So what advice would you give on what's worked and what hasn't as you're kind of progressing through your career and advocating for that next promotion? And you touched on it a little bit, but, I loved that you had kind of talked about this, because I do think, sponsorship and some of these other things you mentioned are so crucial.
Yeah, so like I said, I already touched on that. And one thing I actually want to say is the part of the career that you touched on is sort of the later part of my career, because it wasn't a straight line for me, right? So I was in Morgan Stanley, and I made the transition to engineering manager. Then 2008 came when everybody got laid off, including myself. And then I went for like a series of jobs where I was not in a leadership role. I was like in a senior engineering role. And it took me kind of a while to get back to that career and get back to leadership roles. So I guess the advice I would give is, like, first of all, like, it doesn't have to be a straight line. Like, and that it's okay, like if you take a step back, or you have some challenges in your career, that doesn't mean that you failed. You can then, you really kind of need to have faith and kind of stick with it. Sometimes, like, perseverance is important. But yeah, ultimately, to just reiterate what I said, don't just work hard and expect things to happen. That just doesn't work that way. You really need to find a sponsor, really. Ultimately, that's what helped me. I had people, the startup when I joined Selerity, I had the CTO of Selerity was somebody that I really got along well, and he believed in my ability. He promoted me up. And then also the CEO of Selerity like really believed in me as well. And so that really what helped me in the end. I mean, they knew my skill level. They knew that I had the goods, that I had the leadership experience that can make those transitions. They believed in me and they promoted me, and that's what happened when we got acquired as well. The CEO of our company, our small startup, when that got acquired by this really large fintech company, he climbed the ranks really quickly and he became the chief product officer for the whole analytics division. It was partially due to my relationship with the CEO of our startup that I'm in the role that I'm in now. And not to say that I don't have the skills, but it was a combination of things. So I had the skills and he believed in me, and that's why I'm in the role that I'm in now.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your tips around sponsorship and visibility. I think that's very key as you get more and more senior in leadership roles and even in IC roles, honestly. I also really like you sharing that it's not linear, that you had gone back to being an IC and then back to being in management. Similar to my story, I've gone back and forth several times and it's not a setback. It's like you learn so much in the different roles that you take back to being a manager again or being an IC. So let's pivot to our main topic, bouncing back from layoffs. It feels like we're seeing daily LinkedIn posts from folks being laid off. Josie and I chatted a bit about this in our Welcome Back episode this season. However, I think it's a crucial topic for us to dive into given the current situation in tech. And you mentioned that you were laid off at Morgan Stanley during the last financial crisis, 2008. Can you talk a little bit about how you were impacted by that?
Yes, and just to add to your point about the current climate, just yesterday the Silicon Valley Bank imploded. So I expect there'll be a big implosion of startups as a domino effect from that. So it's definitely a challenging time. Big tech is laying off, now startups are imploding. And tech has been so stable and so lucrative for so long. People forget. Like, I mean, I've started my career in the 90s, so I remember the first dot-com bubble when it burst. Then I went for the financial crash, and now, so it's to me, it's not like a new experience, but for a lot of people that started a career like a decade ago, this is new. Yeah, so back to your question about the layoff in Morgan Stanley in 2008. That was the very first time I've ever been laid off, let go. And that was after 12 years of working in the industry. So it was rough. It was hard. It was, emotionally challenging. And then on top of it, because, it's not just an isolated layoff, you are getting laid off in the midst of the financial crisis. So you're worried about, okay, oh my God, am I ever going to be able to get a job? How long is this thing going to last? And I'm part of like the financial industry in New York, which is like ground zero for this implosion. So it was kind of a scary time in that sense. I guess in a way it was challenging, but at the same time I was lucky because I was already married at the time. I had a very supportive husband. He kept the job, so he wasn't in the financial industry. So really that made a big difference that I had a supportive partner. But it was tough for me on a personal level because you invest so much of yourself in your career. It's kind of becomes part of who you are. So when you lose your job, it's like the first thing you think of is like, well, what now? Who am I now? What's next? It's like a very disorienting time. So yeah, it took me a few months to kind of get grounded and really start looking for a job, like again in the middle of this fallout. And a few months later, I was able to land my next job, but it was, yeah, it definitely was challenging. I had to go for a lot of interviews. And because I was interviewing for not a management role, but like the engineering role, there were a lot of, and the senior engineering role at that, there were a lot of like challenging technical interviews, like marathon sessions. And it's really, it can be tough because like you think you know your stuff, you've been in your career for over a decade, and then you go back to that and it's like exam time and you start to question your skills, and it is challenging, yeah. But yeah, I mean, in the end, I think what helped me is, and again, this was my first layoff. I've had two more in my career after that. It was challenging each time, but it helped me in a sense that I felt like because I was able to recover and get a job and pivot and get my next career, I what it helped me learn is that as long as you persevere, you can always recover. You can always go back to it. Like you can bounce back. It's, and if you did it 3 times, then, then I think it really kind of gave me a lot of confidence in the end. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to be just fine. I've done this 3 times and I survived and it's okay. So, so that's, yeah, I guess that was the takeaway. It was a hard lesson, but it was an important lesson in a sense, just building that resiliency.
And thank you so much for sharing that because, I think what isn't talked about enough is, there is a big emotional impact when you're laid off, right? And part of it isn't just, applying and pushing through and applying for roles, right? Even though I do love the fact that you also touched on, hey, interviewing is kind of a skill in and of itself, right? So just because you're an amazing IC doesn't mean you're going to be successful at interviewing. And sometimes we put it really on ourselves, right? And so, but especially kind of on the emotional side, right? What is some advice that you would give folks who might have been impacted by these recent layoffs and are starting to look forward?
If you have an opportunity to take the time, not jump into interviewing right away, do it. Not everybody can do it, right? But if you can, I think it's important because you should reflect on where you are in your career now, where you really want to go next. Because what you don't want to do is just jump into the very next role that like the recruiter gave you or that you found that might not be a good fit. So I think that's kind of the important part. Make sure you process the layoff, the emotional fallout of it, and that you took the time to think through of where you want to head next, and that you do it in a more kind of directed way, not just like, oh my God, I got to get a job, or else. And that's why I think what I really learned is like what you should be doing is you should be preparing for layoffs from the very start. Like the first time you get your very first job throughout your career, you should be prepared that this may eventually happen. I mean, this is like corporate America. This is just part of the reality. So don't get caught off guard because like what happened to me in Morgan Stanley is I spent so that was like my second job out of college, 8 years that I've spent there. All of my network and everything was just Morgan Stanley. And that was a problem because when I got laid off, it's like, you know, I don't know anybody outside of Morgan Stanley. I don't even, and the job, when I got the job in Morgan Stanley was not for a recruiter, it was from my college friend. So I had zero network. Like I didn't know any recruiters. I didn't, yeah, I mean, that was my whole network was that company. And that was a big problem, because I was like, oh my God, what do I do now? I don't know anybody. So like you shouldn't wait for that to happen. That's kind of my point. Like you should network, you should talk to people in other companies. You should find good recruiters because good recruiters are really hard to find. There's a lot of recruiters that are not that great. And the way the model is set up for recruiters is they work for companies, they don't work for you. So they prioritize the company's needs, not your needs. So that's why I think, first of all, it's better to find your next position for networking, not necessarily for recruiters. But if you do go for recruiters, make sure it's a good recruiter that you trust and that you know will try to look out for you. So even though that's not how they're incentivized.
Those are some really good tips. I love that you are recommending folks really network outside of their company to make those connections, especially in preparation for your next career move, whether voluntary or involuntary.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, there's that huge emotional aspect that we just talked about. But then, beyond that, how can someone who has been laid off effectively present themselves to potential employers and also overcome potential concerns or biases around the employment gap?
Going back to what I said, it's important to work for the emotional fallout. And the reason is because you don't want to appear like vulnerable, frazzled, or desperate in the interviews. Like you don't want to give off that vibe. So make sure you're in a good place emotionally before you start interviewing. And then the gap really, what I found, like I know I worried about it a lot for my career, but in the end, what I found is a lot of times it doesn't really matter as much. They don't really ding you for that as much, especially if you're a woman, because they're so used to like women taking time off to take care of their kids or something else, take care of their families. That it's kind of, in a way, I think it's even easier. It's kind of easier for women to explain that the way than it is for men, your career gaps. So really, or you could. I would say if you have a really lengthy gap, try to freelance, and then you could just put consulting on your resume, and nobody's gonna ask twice what kind of consulting you did. So it's really, I would say this is really should be the least of your worries. You can definitely unless it's a huge gap and then you have nothing there of 5 to 10 years, and yeah, that's gonna be tough to overcome in tech. But if it's a year or a few months, it's really, I don't think it's a big challenge. At least personally, from my experience, I haven't been impacted by the gaps that much. And I did have gaps of a few months or a year in the past, and that didn't impact me as much in finding my next role.
Yeah, and I think especially with right now, the current situation with the layoffs, because it's kind of you're kind of part of a cohort now, right? You're not just one person who's been laid off.
Yeah.
And so I think also, especially in the current market, it can be easier to kind of explain because you're like, I'm just part of this cohort of folks who've been laid off. And so, and we talked about the emotional impact for the folks who've been laid off. But one of the things I wanted to touch on as we're kind of wrapping up here is as leaders, there's an emotional impact of executing a layoff. When I was at Zynga, I actually had to lay off 6 people on my birthday. And it was hard, but I made sure to have conversations with each and every employee to make sure they were clear on what was happening, that it wasn't about them personally, and making sure that they understood next steps. I would be there as a reference for them. And honestly, I see that as something that's missing a lot in today's email-based layoffs. But I realized after I executed the layoffs, I needed to give myself time to process how I felt about the whole experience and to be able to successfully keep managing the next day. And so do you have any advice for leaders who, may have to execute layoffs or may have just done some layoffs and how to handle your feelings afterwards?
So I would say it's definitely, don't ignore it. It is emotional, right? Especially if you have to lay off people you worked with for many years. So definitely process it for yourself, but also if you're managing a team which was impacted by layoff, make sure you talk to everyone one-on-one about it and level with them and try to be as transparent as possible, because that's also important, to make sure that these people that were impacted by this layoff as part of the team, that they know that they're being heard, that their feelings are also being addressed. Because yeah, it is tough. Especially, like I said, especially if it's someone you worked with for a long time and they get laid off. It's an impact on both the manager that has to do that choice and that stuff too, and then the people that stay behind.
Well, thank you for sharing that. So, at the end of each episode, we like to ask our guests to share a retaining tip of the week. Yuliya, what is one tip you'd like to share with the women in the tech industry?
I'd say don't be passive in your career. Be an active participant and take risk. If you notice that you're in a place where your career growth has stagnated, and you don't have access to mentors or opportunity to connect with a sponsor that would advocate for your next promotion, then maybe the company that you're in, if you don't have any opportunities to change this, maybe it's not the right place for you. And then you really should look to move somewhere else, because what you don't want to happen is, you stay another decade in a place like this where your career completely stagnates and then you get laid off or something else happens. So yeah, don't be passive. You have to advocate for yourself. You have to build a network, and if the place is not the right fit, move on and make sure you find the next place to go to. Don't stay.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that tip of the week and for being a guest on our podcast.
Thank you. It was lovely to meet you both.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast comes to you in collaboration with the SheTO community. Did you know that less than 9% of engineering exec roles are held by women? SheTO is on a mission to change that. SheTO is a private network for women and non-binary engineering leaders with the goal of accelerating careers of our members and building their high-powered network. Learn more at sheto.org.
Thanks for listening to this latest episode of the Retaining WIT podcast. You can keep up with our episodes at retainingwit.com, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast shows. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a review so we can grow our audience. Thank you.